The courtroom was silent. The kind of silence that makes your heart pound so loudly, you can hear it in your ears. Every eye was fixed on the little girl standing in the middle of the courtroom. The judge, a stern-looking man with silver hair and glasses that made him look even more serious, was watching her closely. Tears welled up in his eyes as the girl spoke. Her voice was steady, yet filled with so much emotion that it sent chills down everyone's spine. The attorneys, the people in the audience, even the officers standing by the door, they all sat frozen, listening to her every word. The little girl's name was Emily Carter. She was only 10, but the words coming out of her mouth carried more weight than anyone had expected. Her tiny hands trembled as she gripped the microphone. She took a deep breath and said something so powerful that gasps filled the room. "I forgive you," she said, looking straight at the man standing in handcuffs. "Even though you hurt me, even though you hurt my family, I forgive you." The judge's hands shook as he removed his glasses and wiped his eyes. He had been on the bench for over 20 years, and never had he witnessed anything like this. But why was Emily in court? Who was the man in handcuffs? And what had he done to her? The story began months ago, on a cold November night. It had been the happiest day of Emily's life. Her mom, dad, and big brother had taken her to the amusement park. She had never been on a roller coaster before, and she screamed so loud that people probably heard her from miles away. She ate cotton candy until her fingers were sticky, and she won a giant teddy bear at the ring toss. Everything was perfect. As the night fell and the lights of the amusement park twinkled like stars, Emily and her family climbed into their car, ready to go home. She snuggled up in the back seat, holding her teddy bear tightly, smiling to herself. But then, the sound of screeching tires, a bright flash of headlights, a deafening crash, then darkness. When Emily opened her eyes, she was lying on the ground. The car was upside down, glass shattered everywhere. Her head hurt. Her arms and legs felt heavy. Sirens screamed in the distance. A man ran up to her. He looked scared. She couldn't understand what he was saying. Everything was blurry. Then, she saw something that made her stomach drop. Her parents weren't moving. She wanted to call out to them, but no sound came from her mouth. Someone lifted her up and placed her on a stretcher. Everything started spinning. The world was slipping away again. Then, darkness. Days later, Emily woke up in a hospital bed. Machines beeped around her. A nurse rushed to her side. "Emily, sweetie, you're okay," the nurse said softly. Her throat was dry. Her head still hurt. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Then, she remembered. Mom, Dad. Her heart pounded as she turned her head, searching the room. Where were they? Where was her brother? The door opened, and her Aunt Lisa walked in. Her eyes were red and puffy, like she had been crying for days. She rushed to Emily's side and held her hand. Emily's tiny fingers gripped her aunt's as she whispered, "Where's Mom and Dad?" Her aunt froze. Tears slipped down her cheeks. She shook her head, and Emily knew. She knew before her aunt even said the words. Her parents were gone. The next few weeks felt like a nightmare that wouldn't end. She stayed at her aunt's house, barely speaking, barely eating. Her big brother, Jake, had been in the hospital too, but he survived with a broken arm and some bruises. They barely talked about what happened. It hurt too much. Then came the day of the trial. A man named Robert Miller was responsible for the crash. He had been drinking and ran a red light. He didn't stop. He didn't check to see if they were okay. He just drove away. The police found him hours later, asleep in his car. Emily was scared when she saw him in court. He didn't look like a monster. He looked sad, tired, almost broken. But that didn't change what he did. At first, she didn't want to speak in court. The idea of standing in front of all those people made her stomach hurt. But then, she thought about what her mom used to say. Kindness is stronger than anger. Emily, even when people hurt you, show them kindness. She didn't understand how that was possible. But when the judge asked if she had anything to say, she knew she had to try. So, she stood up, walked to the microphone, and she spoke. She told everyone how much she missed her parents, how every night she hugged her teddy bear tight, wishing they were still here, how she wanted to hate Mr. Miller, but she knew hate wouldn't bring them back. Then, She did the one thing no one expected. She forgave him. And now, the entire courtroom was in tears. The judge stared at her, his lips pressed together. He wasn't just crying because he was sad. He was crying because he had never seen someone so young with a heart so big. Even the officers standing by the door wiped their eyes. Mr. Miller, the man who had taken everything from her, broke down sobbing. He couldn't even look at her. He covered his face with his hands, his whole body shaking. But then, a loud crash echoed through the courtroom. The doors burst open. A man ran inside, his face red with anger. "This is wrong," he shouted, pointing at Mr. Miller. Everyone turned in shock. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, because the man shouting was her brother, Jake. Jake's voice boomed through the courtroom. His face was red with fury, his hands clenched into fists. "This man killed our parents, and you're just going to forgive him?" He shouted at Emily, his voice shaking. Emily gasped. She had never seen her brother like this before. He was always the strong one, the one who protected her. But now, he looked different. His eyes burned with rage, his body trembling with emotion. The judge banged his gavel. "Young man, you need to calm down." But Jake didn't listen. He pointed at Robert Miller, the man in handcuffs. "He destroyed our family. He took everything from us. He should suffer for what he did." Tears streamed down his face. The entire courtroom was silent. Emily's heart ached. She understood Jake's pain. She felt it too, every single day. But as she looked at the man in handcuffs, something inside her whispered that there was another way. Before she could say anything, Robert Miller finally spoke. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "I deserve your hate," he said, looking at Jake. "I deserve whatever punishment I get." But, his voice cracked, "I never meant to hurt anyone." Jake clenched his jaw. "But you did." Robert nodded slowly. "I know." Jake shook his head, his breathing ragged. "I can't believe this," he muttered. He turned on his heel and stormed out of the courtroom. Emily's chest tightened. She wanted to go after him, but her feet felt glued to the ground. The judge cleared his throat, his voice thick with emotion. "We will take a brief recess." He banged the gavel again, and the courtroom erupted into whispers. Emily slowly stepped down from the witness stand. She felt like she couldn't breathe. People were looking at her, murmuring about what had just happened. "Did you hear what she said? She forgave him. A little girl forgave him. I don't know if I could have done that." She ignored them all and ran out of the courtroom, searching for Jake. She found him outside, sitting on the courthouse steps, his head in his hands. She sat beside him, neither of them speaking for a while. "I hate him, Emily," Jake finally whispered. "I hate him so much." Emily looked down at her hands. "I know." Jake wiped his face with the sleeve of his hoodie. "How can you forgive him? After everything?" She thought about it for a moment before answering. "Because hating him won't bring Mom and Dad back." Jake's jaw tightened. "No, but it might make him feel as bad as we do." Emily shook her head. "I think he already does." Jake scoffed. "You're too nice, Em." She looked at her brother, really looked at him. He wasn't just angry, he was hurting. She could see it in his eyes, the same pain she felt every day. Before she could say anything else, a voice called out, "Emily, Jake." They turned to see their Aunt Lisa walking toward them, her face full of worry. "The judge wants to see us in his chambers," she said. Jake frowned. "Why?" Lisa sighed. "He just wants to talk." "Come on." Emily and Jake followed their aunt down the hallway, their footsteps echoing against the marble floors. When they entered the judge's office, he was sitting behind his desk, his glasses resting on top of a stack of papers. He motioned for them to sit. "I wanted to speak to you both privately," he said, his voice gentle. "Emily, what you did today was extraordinary. And Jake, your feelings are completely understandable." Jake crossed his arms. "So what now?" The judge leaned forward. "I wanted to ask you both something important. The law will decide Mr. Miller's punishment. But what happens after that is up to you." Emily and Jake exchanged a confused glance. The judge continued, "There's something called restorative justice. It means that instead of just punishing someone, we also try to help them understand the harm they've caused and make things right." Jake scoffed. Make things right? He can't bring them back. The judge nodded. No, he can't. But he can try to make amends in other ways. The question is, do you want to be a part of that process? Jake stood up abruptly. No, I don't want anything to do with him. He turned and walked out. Emily looked at the judge. What would we have to do? The judge studied her. Just talk to him. Let him see the pain he caused, face to face. It's your choice, Emily. She swallowed hard. Could she really do that? Could she sit in a room with the man who took her parents away? She didn't know the answer, but something inside her told her that this was just the beginning. And then, a loud bang echoed from the hallway. A scream followed. Emily and the judge jumped up as the door burst open. A police officer ran inside, his face pale. There's a situation. Jake's in trouble. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. What do you mean Jake's in trouble? She cried, her voice shaking. The police officer didn't answer right away. He was already moving, signaling for them to follow. Aunt Lisa grabbed Emily's hand and rushed after him, the judge trailing behind. As they stepped into the hallway, chaos unfolded before them. People were gasping. Officers were running. And then, Emily saw him. Jake was pinned against the wall by two officers, struggling against their grip. His face was red with anger, his eyes wild. And standing a few feet away, holding his arm like he was in pain, was Robert Miller. Emily's stomach twisted. What happened? Aunt Lisa demanded. One of the officers turned to her. Your nephew attacked Mr. Miller. Emily's breath caught. What? Jake's face was twisted in fury. He deserved it, he shouted. He doesn't get to walk around like he's some victim. He killed Mom and Dad. Robert Miller looked defeated. He didn't fight back. He didn't even raise his hands to defend himself. He just stood there, staring at the ground, blood trickling from a cut on his cheek. Emily couldn't move. Everything was spinning. This was her worst fear. Jake wasn't just angry. He was letting his anger control him. Take your hands off him. Aunt Lisa snapped at the officers. He's just a kid. We understand, ma'am. One of the officers said gently, loosening his grip, but attacking someone in a courthouse is serious. We need to. I'm not sorry. Jake interrupted, his voice shaking. He looked at Emily, his eyes full of rage and something else, pain. You can forgive him if you want, but I never will. And with that, he broke free from the officers and stormed out the door. Emily wanted to run after him, but her feet wouldn't move. She turned to Robert Miller. He looked at her for the first time, and then he did something no one expected. He nodded, as if he understood Jake's anger, as if he agreed with it. And then he whispered, I don't deserve forgiveness. Emily felt something heavy settle in her chest. Before she could respond, Aunt Lisa gently pulled her away. Come on, we need to find Jake. Emily followed, but her mind was spinning. Everything was falling apart. Jake was out of control, and Robert Miller didn't even want to be forgiven. They found Jake outside, sitting on a bench with his head in his hands. Aunt Lisa let out a deep breath and sat beside him. Jake, honey, what were you thinking? Jake didn't answer right away. When he finally did, his voice was hollow. I'm tired, he whispered. Emily sat on his other side. Of what? He exhaled sharply. Of pretending. Of sitting in that courtroom and listening to people talk about what's fair for that man. Like it's just some legal thing. It's not fair, Em. None of this is fair. Emily swallowed hard. I know. Jake lifted his head, looking at her with tired eyes. You're stronger than me, he admitted. I can't do what you did. Emily frowned. What do you mean? He clenched his jaw. I can't let go of the anger. I won't. It's the only thing keeping me from breaking completely. Emily's heart ached. Jake had always been the one to protect her. But now, he was the one who needed protecting. Before she could say anything, Aunt Lisa spoke. You're allowed to be angry, Jake, she said gently. But you have to decide. Do you want that anger to help you or destroy you? Jake let out a bitter laugh. Help me? How? Aunt Lisa sighed. Anger can fuel change. But if you let it control you, it'll eat you alive. Jake shook his head. I don't care. Emily reached for his hand, squeezing it. I do. Jake closed his eyes. I just miss them so much. His voice broke. I don't know how to do this without them. Emily felt tears sting her eyes. I don't either, she admitted. But we have to try. Jake didn't answer. The three of them sat in silence for a long time. Then, Aunt Lisa's phone buzzed. She looked at the screen and sighed. That was the judge. He still wants to see us. Jake groaned. Great. More talking. Emily took a deep breath. Maybe it's important. Jake rubbed his temples. Fine. Let's just get it over with. Back in the judge's office, things felt different. The judge leaned back in his chair, studying them carefully. After what happened in the hallway, I won't pretend this is easy for any of you. Jake crossed his arms, clearly not in the mood. Just say whatever you have to say. The judge sighed. I've thought a lot about what to do with Mr. Miller. There's no question. He will serve time. But, he hesitated. Emily, your forgiveness today changed something. Jake scoffed. Not for me. The judge ignored that. I believe in second chances, and I believe in justice, which is why I want to give you both a choice. Emily blinked. A choice. The judge nodded. You can let the court decide everything, like in any other case. Or, you can choose to be part of a restorative justice process. Jake frowned. We already talked about this. The judge looked at him carefully. I don't think you understand what it means. Jake leaned forward, irritated. Then tell me. The judge folded his hands. It would mean sitting down with Mr. Miller, face to face, talking about what happened, holding him accountable your way. Jake let out a short, humorless laugh. You want me to talk to him? Yes, the judge said simply. Because real justice isn't just about punishment. It's about making sure something like this never happens again. Emily felt her stomach twist. She wasn't sure she was ready for that. And from the look on Jake's face, he definitely wasn't. No way, Jake said, shaking his head. You can forget it. Emily stayed quiet. The judge sighed. I won't force you, but I want you to think about something. What if, instead of just locking him away, you could make him understand what he's done? Really understand? Jake's hands clenched into fists. He should already understand. He killed them. The judge's eyes didn't waver. Then make sure he never forgets. The room was silent. Emily swallowed. Jake looked at her, searching her face. You're actually considering this? He asked in disbelief. Emily hesitated. I don't know. Jake let out a sharp breath. You're unbelievable. He turned to the judge. We're done here. He stood up, storming toward the door. But before he could leave, the door opened. A guard stepped in, looking uneasy. Judge, we have a situation, he said. The judge frowned. What is it? The guard hesitated, then looked at Emily and Jake. It's Robert Miller, he said. He's refusing to see anyone. He's locked himself in his cell and won't eat. Emily's breath caught. Jake frowned. Why should we care? The guard hesitated. Because he just told the officers that he doesn't want to live anymore. The air in the room felt heavy. Jake went completely still. Emily's heart pounded. She had forgiven him. Jake hated him. But now, what if they were about to lose him too? The words hung in the air like a heavy storm cloud. Robert Miller didn't want to live anymore. Emily's stomach twisted. She had imagined so many outcomes. Anger, guilt, even regret. But not this. Not him giving up completely. Jake was the first to react. His fists clenched, his jaw tightening. So, why should we care? The guard hesitated, glancing at the judge. Because whether you care or not, it's happening. Jake scoffed, shaking his head. He's just trying to get attention. The judge sighed. Maybe, but what if he's not? Emily looked at her brother. She could see the war inside him. The rage, the pain, the part of him that still wanted revenge. But there was something else too. Uncertainty, fear. A part of him that, no matter how much he hated Robert Miller, didn't truly want him to die. The judge folded his hands together. Jake, I know you're angry, but let me ask you this. Do you want him to take the easy way out? Jake snapped his head toward him. The easy way? The judge nodded. Death means he never has to face what he did. Never has to carry the weight of his choices. If he gives up now, he escapes the pain. But if he lives, he carries it. Every day, Jake's breathing grew unsteady. He should suffer, he muttered. But his voice trailed off. The judge watched him carefully. But what? Jake swallowed hard, looking down. He didn't answer. Aunt Lisa rubbed his back. Honey, you don't have to decide anything right now. But we do need to think about what happens next. Emily hesitated. Her mind was spinning. Did she want to help? Did she want to get involved? Or did she just want to let things go? Can we see him? She asked suddenly. Everyone turned to her. The guard hesitated. He hasn't been taking visitors, but if he's refusing to eat, maybe he'll talk to us, she pressed. Maybe. I don't know. Maybe he needs to hear something from us. Jake scoffed. What? More forgiveness? No thanks. Emily turned to him. Jake, if he dies, you'll never get to say what you need to say. You'll never get to tell him how much he hurt you. You'll never get to make him listen. Jake opened his mouth, then shut it. The judge nodded. All right, I'll allow it. But only if Jake agrees. Jake exhaled sharply, raking a hand through his hair. He looked at Emily. If I do this, I'm not holding back. Emily swallowed. I wouldn't expect you to. Jake sighed. Fine, let's do it. The jail was colder than Emily expected. As she and Jake walked down the long hallway, escorted by a guard, the air felt heavy. The walls were gray. The smell of bleach and metal filled the air. The sound of distant murmurs and shuffling feet echoed through the halls. And then, they reached his cell. Robert Miller sat on the small cot, staring at the floor. He didn't look up when they arrived. Hey, the guard said. You've got visitors. No response. The guard sighed and stepped aside. You get 5 minutes. Emily took a deep breath and stepped forward. Mr. Miller? Silence. Jake crossed his arms. Figures. You don't even have the guts to face us. Slowly, Robert lifted his head. His eyes were hollow, dark circles underneath them. He looked thinner than he had in court, like he hadn't been sleeping. What do you want? He rasped. His voice was weak, barely above a whisper. Jake's eyes darkened. We want you to live. Robert let out a bitter laugh. Why? So I can rot in prison? Jake clenched his fists. No. So you have to face what you did. So you can wake up every day knowing you destroyed our lives. Emily flinched at his words, but she didn't stop him. This was Jake's pain. He needed to say it. Robert exhaled, shaking his head. I already know. Jake scoffed. Yeah? Then why are you trying to run from it? Robert's shoulders sagged. Because I don't deserve to be here. Jake's eyes flashed with anger. You're right. You don't deserve to be here. You deserve worse. Emily placed a hand on Jake's arm, gently pulling him back. Then she turned to Robert. You don't deserve to be here, she said softly. But you are. And that means you have a choice. Robert frowned slightly. A choice. She nodded. You can give up. Or you can try to make up for what you did. Robert let out a shaky breath. And how do I do that? Emily swallowed. By listening. By changing. By making sure you never hurt anyone again. Robert looked away, guilt swimming in his eyes. I don't know if I can. Jake shook his head. That's your problem. You never take responsibility. You're a coward. Robert flinched. Maybe I am. Emily hesitated. Then she said the one thing that had been sitting in her heart. Jake and I have to live with this for the rest of our lives, she whispered. But so do you. So don't take the easy way out. Silence filled the cell. Robert's hands trembled. He looked at them, really looked at them, for the first time. I'm sorry, he whispered. I know that's not enough. I know it never will be. But I am. Jake's face twisted. It's not enough, he said hoarsely. And it never will be. Robert nodded, looking down. I know. The guard stepped forward. Time's up. Emily took a deep breath and stood up. She glanced at Robert one last time. Then she turned to Jake. Are you ready? Jake hesitated. He looked at Robert one last time, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded. Yeah, he muttered. Let's go. Outside the jail, the cold air hit them like a wave. Aunt Lisa was waiting for them by the car. How did it go? She asked softly. Jake didn't answer. He just stared at the ground. Emily let out a slow breath. I don't know. Aunt Lisa studied Jake's face. Honey. Jake looked up at her. His eyes weren't filled with rage anymore. They weren't even filled with sadness. They were just tired. I still hate him, Jake admitted. But I don't want him to die. Aunt Lisa nodded. That's enough for now. Jake let out a breath. What happens next? Emily didn't know, but something told her this wasn't over. Not yet. And then, a car pulled up in front of them. A man in a suit stepped out, holding a briefcase. He looked straight at Aunt Lisa. Miss Carter? She frowned. Yes? The man adjusted his glasses. I'm here on behalf of Robert Miller's lawyer. He wants to make an offer. Emily's heart skipped a beat. An offer? Jake tensed beside her. What kind of offer? Aunt Lisa asked warily. The man sighed. He wants to give up his appeal. But only if Emily and Jake agree to one condition. Emily's chest tightened. What condition? The man looked at them carefully. He wants to meet with you one last time. Just the two of you. No lawyers. No judge. Jake inhaled sharply. Emily's stomach twisted. One last meeting. One final conversation. But what did Robert Miller have left to say? Emily's heart pounded as the man in the suit stood before them, waiting for an answer. He wants to meet with us? She repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. The man nodded. Yes. No lawyers, no judge. Just you two and him. Jake scoffed, shaking his head. And what, exactly, does he think that'll do? He wants to beg for forgiveness again? I'm not interested. The man exhaled. He's not asking for forgiveness. He said he just wants to talk. Jake crossed his arms. Talk about what? I don't know, the man admitted. But he was very clear. He won't appeal his sentence if you agree to this meeting. Aunt Lisa frowned. This feels manipulative. What if he's trying to lessen his sentence somehow? The man shook his head. It won't affect his time in prison. He's already accepted the plea deal. But this is personal. Emily glanced at Jake. His jaw was tight, his hands in fists. She could tell he was fighting himself, torn between his hatred and his curiosity. Why should we do anything for him? Jake muttered. Emily hesitated. Maybe it's not about doing it for him. Jake turned to her, his eyes burning. Then who is it for? Emily swallowed hard. For us. Jake's nostrils flared. I don't need to hear anything else from him. Emily met his gaze. Then why do you look like you want to? Jake flinched. He turned away, rubbing his hands over his face. This is a mistake. The man in the suit spoke again. You don't have to decide now. But if you want to meet with him, it has to be soon. Jake exhaled sharply, his shoulders tense. Emily placed a hand on his arm. We don't have to do this, she said gently. But if we don't, we'll never know what he had to say. Jake clenched his jaw. He was silent for a long time. Then, finally, he muttered, Fine. Emily's stomach twisted. She wasn't sure if she was ready for this. But she knew one thing. This was the last time they would ever speak to Robert Miller. And whatever happened next, it would change everything. The meeting was set for the next day. Emily barely slept that night. She tossed and turned, her mind replaying everything that had happened. She thought about the courtroom, about the accident, about the moment she forgave him, and about Jake, her brother, who was still drowning in his pain. Would this meeting help? Or would it just open old wounds? The next morning, she barely touched her breakfast. Jake was the same, staring blankly at his plate. Aunt Lisa drove them to the prison in silence. Emily felt the air grow colder as they arrived. It wasn't just the temperature. It was the weight of what they were about to do. A guard escorted them through a series of locked doors until they reached a small, gray room with a single metal table. Robert Miller was already there. His wrists were cuffed to the table, and he looked even thinner than before. His face was lined with exhaustion, his eyes hollow. For a long time, no one spoke. Then, finally, Robert took a deep breath. Thank you for coming. Jake let out a bitter laugh. You think we did this for you? Robert shook his head. No, I know you didn't. Emily sat down slowly. Jake remained standing, arms crossed, his entire body tense. What do you want? Jake demanded. Robert hesitated. I wanted to say something that I couldn't say in court. Jake rolled his eyes. Let me guess. More apologies. Robert shook his head. No, I already said I'm sorry. And I know it's not enough. Emily swallowed hard. Then what is it? Robert exhaled shakily. The truth. Jake frowned. What truth? Robert looked down at his hands. About that night. About the accident. Emily's breath caught. What do you mean? Robert lifted his gaze, pain swimming in his eyes. I wasn't alone. Jake's entire body stiffened. What? Robert took a deep breath. There was someone else in the car with me. Emily's heart pounded. Who? Robert hesitated. Then, he whispered a name. And the second it left his lips, Jake lunged at him. Jake lunged forward, his face twisted with fury. You liar! He roared, his hands slamming onto the metal table. Guards rushed in, grabbing him before he could get too close, their hands firm on his arms. Emily gasped, her heart racing as she leaped to her feet. Jake, stop, she cried. Jake struggled against the guards, his breathing ragged. His eyes burned with an uncontrollable rage. You expect us to believe that? You're just trying to shift the blame, aren't you? Robert Miller didn't move. He didn't flinch. He simply sat there, looking defeated. I wish I was lying, he said quietly. But I'm not. Emily's hands shook as she slowly lowered herself back into the chair. She felt like she couldn't breathe. Someone else had been in the car? Who? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Robert hesitated. He looked down, then back up, his eyes filled with shame. My son, he murmured. Emily felt the floor drop beneath her. Jake froze, his entire body stiffening. You have a son? He spat. Robert nodded. His name is Daniel. Emily swallowed hard. Why didn't you say anything before? Robert sighed, rubbing his temples. Because I was protecting him. Jake's hands balled into fists. Protecting him? You killed our parents. You wrecked our lives. And you want us to believe there's someone else involved? Someone you've been hiding this whole time? Robert's face twisted in pain. I wasn't the one driving that night. Emily's breath caught in her throat. The world tilted. The walls seemed to close in around her. What? She whispered. Robert's voice was barely above a whisper. Daniel was the one behind the wheel. Jake let out a sharp, bitter laugh. You are unbelievable. Robert shook his head. I was drunk. I was in the passenger seat. Daniel was supposed to be my designated driver that night. His voice broke. But he had been drinking too. I didn't know until it was too late. Emily stared at him, her mind spinning. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. Jake glared at Robert with nothing but raw hatred. So you took the blame for him? You let the whole world think you did it? Robert nodded slowly. Yes. Jake clenched his jaw so hard Emily thought his teeth might break. Why? Robert exhaled shakily. Because I failed him as a father. Because I was the one who taught him how to drink in the first place. Because I was supposed to protect him, and instead, I led him down the same dark path I followed. His voice cracked. Because I love him. Jake slammed his hands onto the table again. And you didn't love our parents? Robert's face twisted with guilt. I will never forgive myself for what happened. Emily's voice trembled. Where is he now? Robert hesitated. Then, his next words sent ice down Emily's spine. I don't know. Silence filled the room. Jake's breath was ragged. His fingers twitched, like he wanted to punch something. Robert continued, his voice hoarse. The night of the accident, I told him to run. I told him to leave before the cops arrived. And he did. Emily's stomach twisted. So he got away, she murmured. Robert nodded. For now. Jake let out another bitter laugh. Wow. So not only did you kill our parents, but the real person responsible is out there, free? Robert met his gaze. I never stopped looking for him. Jake's expression darkened. You don't get to play the hero now. Robert sighed, rubbing his face. I didn't say anything in court because I knew it wouldn't change anything. I was guilty either way. Jake's whole body shook with rage. Where do you think he is now? Robert swallowed. I don't know for sure. But, he exhaled, I think he might be trying to leave the country. Emily's heart skipped a beat. Jake stiffened. What makes you think that? Robert hesitated. Because 2 days ago, he sent me a letter. Emily and Jake both froze. Robert looked down at his lap. It wasn't much. Just a few words. His voice grew soft. I can't hide forever, but I won't stay here either. I'm sorry, Dad. Emily's hands trembled. Jake's jaw clenched. A deep, unsettling realization settled in the air. Daniel Miller was still out there, and he was running. Before Emily could say anything, the door burst open. A guard stepped in, looking frantic. Sir, he said quickly, turning to Robert. You have a visitor. Robert frowned. A visitor? The guard's face was pale. Yes, he said. It's your son. The room went dead silent. Emily felt her heart drop to her stomach. Jake's hands curled into fists, his breathing sharp and ragged. No, he muttered. No way. Robert Miller looked like he had been punched in the gut. His eyes widened, his face paled, and for the first time since they had walked into the room, he looked afraid. My son, he whispered. Emily's hands trembled. Daniel? The guard nodded. Yes. He showed up at the prison. He asked to see his father. Jake shot up from his chair. Where is he? The guard hesitated. He's waiting outside the visitors area. But I need to warn you. He looks unsettled. Emily's stomach twisted. Unsettled how? The guard sighed. Like a man who has nothing left to lose. The air in the room became suffocating. Robert swallowed hard. I need to see him. Jake scoffed. Oh, now you're ready to face him? Robert turned to Jake, his eyes dark with something unreadable. Yes. Emily could barely think. Daniel Miller was here. Right now. The man who had actually been behind the wheel. The man who had run away, while their parents lay dying in the street. The man who had left his own father to take the blame. She wasn't sure if she wanted to see him, or if she wanted to scream at him. Jake was already heading for the door. Let's go, he muttered. Emily hesitated, her legs shaking. Was she ready for this? No, but she had no choice. The visitors' area was tense. Guards stood by the doors, their hands resting near their belts. The air smelled of sweat and metal. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. And sitting at a table in the middle of the room was Daniel Miller. Emily stopped in her tracks. He was younger than she expected, maybe in his early 20s. His hair was messy, his face unshaven. He wore a gray hoodie, his sleeves pushed up, revealing faint scars along his arms. His eyes were tired, hollow, but the second he saw them enter, he stiffened. His gaze locked onto Emily and Jake, and for a moment, he looked like he was about to run. Jake clenched his fists. You. Daniel swallowed hard. His lips parted, but no words came out. Then, his eyes flickered to Robert, and something inside him cracked. Dad, he whispered. Robert exhaled sharply. Daniel. Emily barely breathed as she stepped forward. Why are you here? Daniel hesitated. Because I couldn't run anymore. Jake let out a sharp laugh. Oh, but you sure ran that night, didn't you? His voice was dripping with venom. You didn't even look back, did you? Daniel flinched like he'd been slapped. You left us to die. Jake roared, his voice echoing through the room. Guards tensed, but they didn't move. Not yet. Daniel's hands trembled on the table. I know. Jake let out a bitter, shaky breath. You knew, and you ran anyway. Daniel closed his eyes, pained. I was scared. Jake slammed his fists onto the table, making Daniel jump. You were scared? His voice cracked. You killed them. You ruined our lives. And you were scared? Emily put a hand on Jake's arm. Jake. But he ripped his arm away. No, Emily. He doesn't get to sit here and act like he's the victim. Daniel's breathing was uneven. He looked at Jake and Emily with so much guilt it made Emily feel sick. I wanted to turn myself in, Daniel said weakly. I swear, I did. But every time I tried, I couldn't. He looked at Robert. Dad told me to run, and I listened. Because I was a coward. Jake's nostrils flared. You don't deserve to sit here and admit that like it's nothing. Daniel's eyes darkened. It's not nothing, he said softly. It's haunted me every second of every day. Emily swallowed. Then why now? Daniel hesitated. His gaze flickered between them. Because I can't run anymore. Because I read about the trial. I read about you. His eyes locked onto Emily. And I saw what you did. Emily frowned. What? Daniel exhaled. You forgave my dad. Silence. Jake's breathing was still rough, but he wasn't shouting anymore. Daniel's hands clenched into fists. And I realized, I don't deserve to be forgiven, but I needed to see you, to tell you the truth. And to tell you, he swallowed hard. I'll turn myself in. Emily's breath caught. Jake blinked. What? Daniel lifted his chin, his hands shaking. I won't run anymore. I'll confess everything. If I'm arrested today, so be it. Jake stared at him, his eyes unreadable. Just like that? Daniel nodded. Just like that. The room was so quiet Emily could hear her own heartbeat. Then, Jake did something she didn't expect. He laughed. But it wasn't a happy laugh. It was broken, sharp, bitter. He wiped his face with his sleeve, then let out a deep, unsteady breath. And what do you expect from us? He asked hoarsely. Do you want me to say thank you? Do you want me to say I forgive you? Daniel's face twisted with pain. No, he whispered. I just wanted to face you. Even if you never forgive me. I needed to see you. Jake shook his head. I will never forgive you. Daniel nodded slowly, as if he had already accepted that. Emily's throat felt tight. She had forgiven Robert. But Daniel, she didn't know if she could. Before she could speak, the guards stepped forward. We need to take him in now, one of them said firmly. Daniel exhaled shakily and nodded. I know. Emily watched as they placed handcuffs on him. He didn't fight. He didn't resist. He just let them take him. And as he was led away, he turned back one last time. I'm sorry, he whispered. Jake looked away. Emily didn't know what to say. And then, he was gone. Outside, the air felt thick with tension. Aunt Lisa met them at the car, concern written all over her face. Are you okay? Emily didn't answer. Jake let out a hollow laugh. No. Aunt Lisa sighed. I know, sweetheart. Jake exhaled sharply, raking a hand through his hair. I don't know what to do with this. His voice cracked. I hated him for so long. I thought if I ever saw him, I'd. He trailed off, shaking his head. I don't know anymore. Emily swallowed. Me neither. For the first time since the accident, the anger inside Jake seemed different. Still there, but not consuming him the way it used to. And for the first time, Emily didn't know what came next. But one thing was certain. This wasn't the end. Not yet. Because forgiveness was a battle. And they were still fighting it. The car ride home was silent. Emily stared out the window, watching the trees blur past. The world outside looked the same. Cars honking, people walking, life moving forward. But inside, everything felt different. Daniel was in custody now. The truth was finally out. The real driver of the car that killed their parents was no longer running. So why didn't she feel relief? Jake sat in the seat beside her, arms crossed, jaw clenched. He hadn't spoken a word since they left the prison. Aunt Lisa kept glancing at them through the rearview mirror, her lips pressed together like she wanted to say something. But she didn't. Because what could she say? Nothing could bring their parents back. Nothing could erase the pain. Nothing could fix this. Emily's hands tightened into fists on her lap. Forgiveness was supposed to make things better. So why did she feel worse? When they got home, Jake went straight to his room and slammed the door. Emily sat at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. Aunt Lisa sighed and sat across from her. Sweetheart, do you want to talk about it? Emily shook her head. I don't know what to say. Aunt Lisa studied her carefully. It's okay to be confused. Emily swallowed hard. I thought if Daniel turned himself in, it would feel like justice. But it doesn't. Aunt Lisa exhaled. That's because justice and closure aren't the same thing. Emily frowned. Then what does closure feel like? Aunt Lisa hesitated. I don't know. But I do know this. You and Jake have been carrying a lot of pain. And even though Daniel's in custody now, that pain isn't going to disappear overnight. Emily looked down at her hands. So what do we do? Aunt Lisa reached over and squeezed her hand gently. We take it one day at a time. Emily nodded slowly, but her chest still felt heavy. One day at a time. That night, Emily lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Sleep wouldn't come. Her mind kept replaying the day, the prison, Daniel's face, the way Jake looked at him with nothing but hatred. Would Jake ever let go of his anger? Would she? She turned onto her side, hugging her pillow tightly. Then, her door creaked open. She sat up quickly. Jake? He stood in the doorway, looking exhausted. His hair was messy, his face pale. He rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. Can't sleep? Emily shook her head. Jake hesitated, then walked in and sat on the edge of her bed. For a long time, he didn't speak. Then, finally, he whispered, I don't know who I am without my anger. Emily's breath caught. Jake kept his gaze on the floor. I hated Robert. I hated Daniel. That hatred kept me going. It made things simple. But now, his voice cracked. Now I don't know what to feel. Emily's throat tightened. I don't either. Jake let out a shaky breath. I don't think I can ever forgive him, Emily hesitated. Maybe not today. Maybe not tomorrow. But maybe someday. Jake clenched his jaw. I don't want to forgive him. Emily swallowed. I know. Silence filled the room. Then, Jake whispered, I miss them. Emily felt tears sting her eyes. Me too. Jake exhaled sharply. It's not fair. Emily nodded. It never will be. Jake rubbed his hands over his face. I don't know how to move on. Emily's voice was barely above a whisper. Then let's figure it out together. Jake looked at her for a long time. Then, finally, he nodded. And for the first time in a long time, Emily felt something small but real. Hope. The next morning, everything felt different, lighter. Emily wasn't sure if anything had truly changed. But for the first time since the accident, she and Jake sat at the breakfast table together, sharing a quiet moment. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Aunt Lisa poured them coffee, well, milk with a splash of coffee, and sat with them. So, she said, what now? Jake shrugged. I have no idea. Emily hesitated. Maybe we don't need to know yet. Aunt Lisa smiled. That's okay too. Emily nodded, taking a deep breath. One day at a time. That was enough. Or at least, she hoped it was. But just as things started to settle, the phone rang. Aunt Lisa frowned and picked it up. Hello? Emily and Jake watched as her expression slowly changed. Her lips parted. Her eyes widened. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, What do you mean Daniel escaped? Emily's breath caught in her throat. Jake shot up from his chair. What did you just say? Aunt Lisa didn't answer. She was gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles were white. I don't understand. How could that happen? Emily felt the room spinning. Daniel had escaped? Jake clenched his fists. Give me the phone. Aunt Lisa didn't even hesitate. She handed it over, her face pale. Jake pressed the phone to his ear. What do you mean he escaped? A voice on the other end spoke rapidly, but Emily couldn't hear the words. She could only hear the pounding of her own heartbeat. Jake's expression darkened. Are you serious? So you're telling me the guy who killed our parents is out there again? His voice rose with every word. Emily grabbed his arm. Jake. He pulled away. No, Emily. This is insane. How did they even let this happen? He turned his back to them, gripping the phone so hard Emily thought it might break. Then, he froze. His entire body went rigid. Aunt Lisa frowned. Jake? His breathing became shallow. Then, he slowly turned around. His face was pale, his eyes wide. And then he whispered, They think he's coming here. The words sent a chill through Emily's spine. Aunt Lisa's hand flew to her mouth. Here, she repeated in shock. Jake nodded, his jaw clenched. They don't know for sure, but he has no money, no car, no place to go. The last thing he said before escaping was something about unfinished business. Emily's stomach twisted. Jake slammed the phone down. We have to lock the doors. Now. Aunt Lisa snapped out of her daze. Okay. Let's not panic. We don't even know if he's coming here. Jake turned on her, his eyes blazing. You want to take that chance? Aunt Lisa hesitated for half a second. No. They moved quickly. Jake locked the front door. Aunt Lisa ran to secure the back. Emily checked all the windows, her fingers trembling. Every sound felt louder. Every shadow felt closer. Her heart pounded as she peeked through the curtains. The street was empty. But for how long? Jake paced the living room. If he does come here, I swear, I'll... Stop, Emily interrupted, her voice shaking. Just stop. Jake turned to her, his hands balled into fists. You're still defending him? Emily shook her head. No, but I don't want you to do something you'll regret. Jake let out a bitter laugh. What I regret is not punching him when I had the chance. Aunt Lisa put a hand on his shoulder. Jake, listen to me. If Daniel shows up, we don't confront him. We call the police. Jake looked away, his jaw tight. Emily swallowed hard. What if he's not here to hurt us? Jake shot her a glare. Are you kidding me? He escaped from jail, Emily. That's not the move of someone who wants to make things right. Emily didn't have an answer for that, because deep down, she was afraid he was right. Hours passed. Every noise made Emily jump. Every passing car sent Jake racing to the window. But Daniel didn't come. Not yet. Aunt Lisa made tea, but no one touched it. The sun dipped below the horizon, and darkness crept in. Emily sat on the couch, hugging a pillow to her chest. Maybe they were wrong, she whispered. Maybe he's not coming. Jake didn't respond. He just kept staring at the door. Aunt Lisa checked her phone for the 100th time. The police have patrol cars nearby. They said they'd call if there's any sign of him. Jake exhaled sharply. Great. So we just wait. No one answered. Because there was nothing else to do. Emily forced herself to breathe. In, out, slow. But then, a noise. Outside. A shuffle. A footstep. Then, a knock. Emily's entire body went cold. Aunt Lisa grabbed her arm. Jake stood frozen, his hands shaking. The knock came again. 3 slow, deliberate taps. Jake reached for the baseball bat by the door. No way, he whispered. Aunt Lisa's voice was tight. We don't know if it's him. Jake clenched the bat. Then let's find out. Emily grabbed his arm. Jake, no. But he yanked away and threw open the door. And standing there, his hoodie soaked from the rain, his face pale and exhausted, was Daniel. For a moment, no one spoke. Daniel's chest rose and fell heavily, like he had been running. His eyes flickered between them, full of something Emily couldn't name. Regret? Desperation? Guilt? Jake lifted the bat, his face twisting with rage. You've got 10 seconds to tell me why you're here. Daniel lifted his hands slowly, as if surrendering. His voice was hoarse. I didn't come to run. I didn't come to fight. Emily swallowed. Then why? Daniel's lips parted. He hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, because someone is trying to kill me. Daniel's words hung in the air like a thundercloud. Jake gripped the baseball bat tighter. You've got to be kidding me. Daniel shook his head, his face pale. I swear. Someone's after me. Emily's heart pounded. She looked at Aunt Lisa, who seemed just as shocked. Jake scoffed. Oh, and let me guess. You want us to save you? Daniel exhaled shakily. I just need to talk. Please. Jake's jaw clenched. His knuckles turned white around the bat. For a second, Emily thought he was going to slam the door in Daniel's face. But then, a car sped down the street. Fast. Too fast. The headlights flooded the porch. And then bang. A gunshot. Emily screamed. Jake grabbed her, yanking her inside as Aunt Lisa dove for cover. Daniel stumbled back, his eyes wide with terror. Bang. Another shot. The sound shattered the night. The window beside them exploded. Glass rained down like sharp raindrops. Get down. Aunt Lisa shouted. Daniel hit the ground, crawling toward the doorway. Jake pulled Emily to the floor, shielding her with his body. The car screeched as it sped away, tires screeching against the pavement. Then, silence. Emily's breath came in sharp gasps. Jake lifted his head slowly. Is everyone okay? Aunt Lisa's hands were shaking, but she nodded. I think so. Daniel groaned, clutching his arm. Blood smeared his sleeve. Emily's eyes widened. You're hurt. Daniel gritted his teeth. It's just a graze. Jake scowled. You expect me to believe that was just some random drive-by? Daniel shook his head, his breathing ragged. No, he swallowed hard. They were after me. Emily's pulse raced. Who? Daniel? Who's trying to kill you? Daniel hesitated, his face twisted with pain. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, the same people who told me to run that night. Emily's stomach dropped. The same people who told you to run, she repeated. Daniel exhaled shakily. I wasn't just scared of getting caught. I was scared of them. Jake let out a bitter laugh. Oh, so now we're supposed to believe you had no choice? Daniel's eyes darkened. You don't understand. Jake slammed the bat onto the floor. Then make me understand. Daniel clenched his jaw. That night, I wasn't just drinking with my dad. I was with them. Emily frowned. Who? Daniel hesitated. His eyes darted toward the broken window, as if expecting another bullet to fly through. Then, finally, he whispered, a gang. Aunt Lisa gasped. What? Daniel rubbed his injured arm, wincing. I didn't mean to get involved, but my dad and we owed people money. Jake's face twisted in disgust. Unbelievable. So not only were you drunk, but you were in debt to some criminals? Daniel flinched. I was stupid. Okay, I was trying to prove something. And that night, when I took the wheel, I thought I was fine. Emily's throat tightened. But you weren't. Daniel shook his head. I wasn't. He looked down at his hands. After the accident, I panicked. The others, my so-called friends, told me to run. They said if I turned myself in, I'd take them all down with me. And if I did that, they'd make sure I didn't survive prison. Jake's fists clenched. So you ran to save your own skin. Daniel swallowed hard. Yes. His voice cracked. But I never stopped looking over my shoulder. Emily sat down, her head spinning. And now, they're after you? Daniel exhaled. I think they always were. But now that I've been caught, now that I was ready to confess, they don't want to take the risk. Jake's nostrils flared. So they sent someone to kill you? Daniel nodded. And if I had been standing any closer to that window, he didn't finish the sentence. Aunt Lisa took a shaky breath. We have to call the police. Daniel tensed. No. Jake scoffed. No. Daniel shook his head. They have eyes everywhere. If the police get involved, they'll know where I am. And they won't miss next time. Emily's hands trembled. Then what do we do? Daniel hesitated. Then, in a voice full of quiet desperation, he said, I need your help. Jake let out a short, bitter laugh. Oh, now you need our help? After everything? Daniel didn't flinch. I know I don't deserve it, but if I don't figure out who's behind this, I won't make it through the night. Jake crossed his arms. And what? You expect us to hide you? Daniel's gaze was pleading. No, I need you to help me stop them. Emily's breath caught. Stop them how? Daniel hesitated. Then, his voice was barely above a whisper. I know where they are. Jake's body stiffened. Emily's heart pounded. Aunt Lisa gasped. You're not going after them. Daniel swallowed. I don't have a choice. Jake's jaw clenched. So you're asking us to what? Come with you? Daniel exhaled. I'm asking you to help end this. Once and for all. Silence filled the room. Then, Jake let out a deep breath. You're insane. Daniel didn't deny it. Emily's stomach twisted. Jake, what do we do? Jake turned to her. His expression was unreadable. Then, in a voice low and dangerous, he said, we end this. Emily's heart pounded. She stared at Jake, barely believing what she had just heard. We end this, she repeated. Jake's face was unreadable. His fists were clenched so tight his knuckles were white. You can't be serious, Aunt Lisa said, her voice shaking. You're not actually considering going with him? Jake exhaled sharply. You think I trust him? No. But if this is real, if there's a chance those people are still out there, trying to cover up what happened, then I want to know. His jaw tightened. I need to know. Emily swallowed hard. She understood. This wasn't just about Daniel anymore. This was about justice. About the people who had let this happen. The ones who had told Daniel to run. The ones who were still willing to kill to keep their secrets. Aunt Lisa shook her head, gripping Jake's arm. Jake, this isn't your fight. Jake turned to her, his eyes dark. They made it my fight when they killed Mom and Dad. Aunt Lisa flinched like he had slapped her. Emily's stomach twisted. How do we even know where to go? She asked, turning to Daniel. Daniel took a shaky breath. I know where they hang out. An old auto shop on the east side of town. I haven't seen them in years, but I know they still run things there. Jake narrowed his eyes. And what, we just walk in? Daniel shook his head. No, we watch. We find out who's still there. Then we get proof, something we can take to the police. Something they can't ignore. Aunt Lisa's voice was sharp. This is insane. Daniel looked at her, his expression hollow. If I don't do this, they will find me. And next time, they won't miss. Emily inhaled sharply. Aunt Lisa ran a hand through her hair. No, absolutely not. I will not let you too. Jake cut her off. You can't stop me. Aunt Lisa's face crumbled. Jake, please. Jake softened just a little. We have to do this, Lisa. Aunt Lisa looked between them, her eyes glistening with fear. You don't. You think you do, but you don't. Emily reached for her aunt's hand. We'll be careful. Aunt Lisa shook her head, but the fight was fading from her eyes. She knew she couldn't stop them. Finally, she exhaled. Fine, but I'm calling the police if you're not back in an hour. Jake nodded. Deal. Daniel looked at him in surprise. You're actually coming? Jake clenched his jaw. I don't trust you. But I do trust myself. Daniel hesitated. What about you? He looked at Emily. Emily's stomach was in knots. This was reckless, dangerous, stupid. But if this was the last piece of the truth, she needed to see it. She squared her shoulders. I'm in. Daniel gave a small, tired nod. Jake grabbed the baseball bat from beside the door. Then let's go. The ride to the east side of town was tense. Daniel sat in the passenger seat while Jake drove. Emily sat in the back, gripping the seat so tight her nails dug into the fabric. The night air was thick, the city lights fading behind them. Finally, the car pulled up a few blocks away from an abandoned auto shop. Jake killed the engine. This is it. Daniel nodded. Yeah. Emily peered out the window. The building was run down, the windows covered in grime. A single flickering light glowed above the entrance. Jake scanned the area. I don't see anyone. Daniel exhaled. They're inside. Trust me. Emily shivered. So what's the plan? Daniel hesitated. We watch. We listen. We find proof. Jake let out a short laugh. Yeah? And what if they see us? Daniel swallowed. Then we run. Emily's stomach twisted. But it was too late to back out now. Slowly, they got out of the car and crept toward the building. The night was silent. Too silent. Emily's heartbeat thudded in her ears. They reached the side of the building, pressing against the cold wall. Daniel pointed to a window that was cracked open. We can hear from there. Jake shot him a glare. If this is a setup... It's not, Daniel whispered. Jake hesitated. Then he nodded. Fine. They crouched beneath the window. Inside, voices murmured. Emily strained to listen. Then, a voice. Low, rough. You sure he's dead? Emily's breath caught. Another voice, deeper. Nah, but he won't last long. We put 2 rounds in him before he ran. Jake stiffened beside her. Daniel went pale. Emily's stomach flipped. They were talking about Daniel. Another voice grunted. We should have finished the job. Emily's hands trembled. The deep-voiced man let out a dry chuckle. We will. Her breath hitched. Daniel inhaled sharply. Jake gritted his teeth. We need to get out of here. Daniel nodded. Now. They turned to move. But then, the gravel crunched behind them. A shadow moved. Emily froze. A voice, low, menacing. Going somewhere? She barely had time to scream before the world exploded into chaos. The moment Emily turned, she saw him. A tall, muscular man with a scar across his cheek, standing just feet away. A gun glinted in his hand under the flickering streetlight. Jake reacted first. Run, he shouted. But it was too late. A second man appeared behind them, grabbing Daniel by the back of his hoodie and slamming him against the wall. Daniel gasped, struggling. But the man twisted his arm behind his back, pinning him in place. Emily's heart raced. No, no, no. Jake gritted his teeth, gripping the baseball bat tightly. Let him go. The man with the scar smirked. Or what? You gonna hit me with your little stick? Jake didn't hesitate. He swung. Hard. The bat cracked against the man's ribs, sending him stumbling back with a grunt. Emily didn't have time to think. She grabbed Daniel's arm and yanked. Move. Daniel gasped in pain, but managed to break free. Jake swung the bat again, but this time, the man caught it. His grip was iron. He ripped it from Jake's hands and threw it to the ground. Then, he punched Jake. Hard. Jake crumpled, groaning in pain. Emily screamed. Daniel grabbed her wrist. Run, Emily. But before they could move, bang, a gunshot split the air. Emily flinched, her ears ringing. Daniel froze. The scarred man sneered. No more running, kid. Daniel turned, his hands raised. I'm done running. His voice was steady. You want me? Take me. Just let them go. Emily's breath caught. No. The deep-voiced man chuckled. Oh, you don't get to make deals. The scarred man lifted his gun. Emily's stomach dropped. Jake groaned on the ground, trying to get up. Daniel's breathing was heavy. It was over. Then, sirens. Flashing red and blue lights flooded the alley. Tires screeched. The men cursed. Cops. In an instant, everything changed. The scarred man turned to run. But, bang, a warning shot from one of the officers. Freeze, a voice boomed. The deep-voiced man cursed again, lifting his hands. Daniel exhaled sharply, stumbling back. Emily's legs nearly gave out. It was over. It was finally over. The next few hours were a blur. The police swarmed the area, arresting the men inside the auto shop. Jake sat on the curb, holding an ice pack to his bruised jaw. He winced. Well, that was fun. Emily elbowed him. Not funny. Jake gave her a weak grin. Okay, a little funny. Aunt Lisa arrived minutes later, nearly in tears as she hugged them both. I told you this was a terrible idea. Jake groaned. Yeah. Daniel sat beside them, silent. The police took his statement, and for the first time, he told the whole truth. Everything. About the gang. About the accident. About running. The officers listened, and when they were done, one of them sighed. You should have turned yourself in a long time ago, kid. Daniel swallowed hard. I know. The officer nodded. Well, you did the right thing tonight. Daniel didn't respond, because deep down, he knew. It was too late for that. A week later, Daniel was sentenced. He accepted a plea deal. No trial. No fighting it. Jake and Emily sat in the courtroom one last time as the judge spoke. Daniel stood with his hands clasped in front of him, his head bowed. His sentence, 15 years. Jake didn't react. Emily wasn't sure what she felt. Relief? Sadness? Closure? Maybe all of it. Maybe none. When Daniel was led away in cuffs, he turned back, just once. His eyes met Emily's. And in them, she saw something she hadn't seen before. Peace. For the first time in years, Daniel wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He was finally facing what he had done. And maybe that was enough. Outside the courthouse, the air was crisp. Jake took a deep breath, shoving his hands into his pockets. So, that happened. Emily nodded. Aunt Lisa hugged them both. I am so proud of you, too. Jake snorted. For almost getting shot? Aunt Lisa sighed. For doing the right thing. Jake looked down. Yeah, I guess. Emily watched him carefully. Are you still angry? Jake thought about it. Then, finally, he exhaled. I think I'll always be a little angry. He glanced at her. But I don't think I need to hold on to it anymore. Emily swallowed. So, do you forgive him? Jake was quiet for a long time. Then, he shook his head. Not yet. Emily nodded. Maybe someday? Jake gave her a small smile. Maybe. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough.